Hi folks, this is Jay. Hope you're okay today. This is my response to Deconverted Man concerning his video on the debate that we're having on the resurrection of Jesus. Did he rise from the dead, and does this prove the existence of God? My video is going to be longer than 10 minutes, Deconverted Man. I've got too much material to put in just a few snippets. So however long it takes me to do my videos, you can take it out of my time in other video responses. Okay, I'm sorry about that, but that's just the way it is. So I'm going to be making 2 or 3 videos at 10-15 minutes length to respond to you. Okay, it's just because I haven't got time and I've got things to do, and I'm just going to get the material out there. First of all, the question that I want to ask is, what I'm going to do is give my argument and then respond to your argument. First of all, I want to ask the question, what criteria as a historian are you showing us that you're being objective? We are doing historical studies, and you need to provide us a historical methodology that you're using in studying the material. That's what historians do. You've not provided us with any methodology so far. I want to ask the question that where are you showing that you're being objective? I think of the atheist community when Anthony Flew, who was an atheist, became a deist, and how the atheist community around the world completely attacked him. We read in There Is a God, Anthony Flew by Roy Abraham Varghese. We read in page 8 about how the atheists treated Anthony Flew when he left their community and became a deist. Insane insults and juvenile caricatures were common in the free-thinking blogosphere. The same people who complained about the Inquisition and witches being burned at the stake were now enjoying a little heresy hunting of their own. So I think it's important for you to show us that you're dealing with this in a scholarly way, and not just in that militant atheist anti-intellectualism that we've seen in the past. First of all, if we're going to do history, we need an objective criteria for doing history. So I'm using Michael Licona's A New Historical Approach, IVP 2010, page 109, 111. He has a criteria for investigating history that secular historians use, and here's the criteria. Number 1, explanatory scope. This means we look at the quantity of facts that our hypothesis accounts. The hypothesis that has the most relevant facts has the best explanatory scope. Second, explanatory power. This looks at the quality of the given facts. If you can explain your position with less ambiguity, then it has better explanatory power. If one has a strong presence but some information missing, you may get some due to the nature of the patchiness of history. Plausibility. The hypothesis conforms to the background knowledge better than other positions. We look at the opponent's view and see if they are confirmed by anything in history or today by the sciences. Fourth, less ad hoc. When we use less non-evidenced assumptions, we are in a better position than using such arguments that lack any evidence. And fifth, illumination. A hypothesis can provide good solutions to historical problems, and if this is the position, it strengthens one case. So that's our methodology for doing historical inquiry. You need to provide your methodology and show us that it is objective. We're using secular historians' methodology. Using the secular historian's methodology, we then go on to gather the facts and information. We note, Dr. Borkham has noted, one of the great New Testament scholars today, has said there is no longer good reasons for supposing that the gospel traditions passed through a lengthy process of oral transmission in the early Christian communities. Dr. Borkham has noticed, and other scholars have noticed, which I'll touch on in more detail, that when we look at the Gospels and the genre of the Gospels, they are actually biographical information and not mythological literature. I will go into that in detail. Secondly, we note that scholarship has a number of facts about Jesus that, if we're going to have a hypothesis, mustn't go away from those basic facts. That I just may mention one or two, but I've written about this at length. Facts, for example: Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. Jesus was a Galilean. Jesus had a controversy in the temple, etc. We've gained a number of facts that, if you've got a hypothesis, you've got to make sure that you're in line with those facts that we know today. Dr. E.P. Sanders has said, in recent decades we have grown more confident about the historical Christ. E.P. Sanders says there is no substantial doubts about the general source of Jesus' life. He's a world authority in the subject. When and where he lived, approximately when and where he died, and the sort of things he did during his public activity. This is in his book, The Historical Figure of Jesus, Penguin, 1993, Dr. E.P. Sanders. So if we're going to have a hypothesis, it's got to be based and rooted in the historical knowledge that we already know. Also, there has been a renaissance in looking at the Jewish context of the New Testament. There have been scholars have begun to see that, such as Jewish scholars such as Joseph Klausner in 1874 to 1958, has led a renaissance in looking at the historical context of the New Testament from a Jewish perspective. Jesus was convinced of his messiahship. Of this there is no doubt, says Dr. Evans. This scholarship grew in momentum with the work of Hans Joachim, Ashta Fakel, and many more. Dr. Evans writes, all of these books attempt to show how fully Jewish Jesus was, and in doing this fly in the face of the dominant forces in the largely German scholarship during this period. Dr. Evans. So what we see here is, as we look at the Gospels in its historical context, they conform to the way ancient historians wrote of that time. As we look at the Jewish context, as we look at modern scholarship, we have gained facts about Jesus. And thirdly, we have seen in the Jewish context, that is the way to look at the life of Jesus. Okay. Without these intellectual tools, we are not going to come up with a decent hypothesis about Jesus' life and death and resurrection. So here are the facts, using our criteria, that we can gain about Jesus. First of all, Jesus was crucified on a cross. We read in Tacitus, Roman historian, AD 55, 120 AD, Christus suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of our procurator Pontius Pilate. We read Lucian, the Greek satirist, AD 120, 180, Christians worshipped a man to this day who was crucified on that account. And then we have Josephus in 38 to 97 AD wrote, Pilate condemned him to be crucified. Because of this historical material, you could say that Josephus has been interpolated a little bit. Most scholars agree that it's genuine Josephus, most of it, apart from a little bit of interpolation here and there. But generally, these historical materials are helpful to gather that Jesus did die on a cross. We also have the Gospels, which are also historical material. You don't have to believe in the inspiration of the Bible to use the Bible as historical material. This is something the atheists seem to keep missing. In Mark chapter 15:25 it says, and it was the third hour that they crucified him. In Luke 23:46, and when Jesus had cried with a loud voice, he said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. Having said thus, he gave up the ghost. And in Matthew 27:35, and they crucified him and parted his garments. Putting all this historical material together, the gospel historical material and ancient historians, we know for a fact that Jesus was crucified. That Jesus was crucified is a sure source of fact, as any fact. That Jesus was crucified is as sure as any fact in the ancient world, says Dominic Crossan, who was a skeptical scholar. Fact number 2. Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, and the tomb became empty. In Matthew 27:57-60 we read, and it was evening, and there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given him. So Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn in the rock. He then rolled a great stone to the door of the tomb and went away. Matthew 27:57 to 60. Now this is mentioned in Mark chapter 15, 42 to 47, and John 18, 38, 42. It's mentioned so much that by the Gospels that historians recognize that this is factual historical material. Once you get one source saying it, but then you get two sources, three sources, then you've got to take it seriously as historically true. And because of the context, in the time of that context, the historians recognize that if that there's no way that the early church would have written that, because if it was not true, because the Sanhedrin would have come down on them and denied it, because Joseph of Arimathea, along with Nicodemus as well, they're connected to the Sanhedrin, they would have the Sanhedrin would have come out and said, no, this is not true, you're lying. The fact that the Sanhedrin didn't do that, the fact that the early church put this material in, historians say and believe that this is correct, that this is historical true material. The other issue as well is enemy attestation is a good way of knowing if something is true. And the enemies against the Christians said that the body of Jesus was stolen. Now when the enemy says something like that, we have to take it seriously. So the enemy said the body has been stolen. What that unwittingly does is tell you that the tomb of Jesus became empty. That was said not by the gospel writers themselves, but by the enemies of Jesus, of the church. So again, enemy attestation helps us to verify historical truth. J.A.T. Robinson of Cambridge, one of the great writers of this time, says, the burial of Jesus is one of the most certain facts about the historical Jesus. And then the third historical fact about Jesus, sorry about this, third historical fact about Jesus is in his book The Resurrection of the Son of God, N.T. Wright has noted that ancient pagans did not believe in a bodily resurrection. And what we find is, as you study the early church, in the Jewish context, the Jews did believe in a bodily resurrection, but it was a resurrection at the end of time. Now, we know as historians, because of this fact, that when the Jewish Christians in Jesus' time, who were Jews, when they are preaching that Jesus rose from the dead, as you look at the historical context, the Jews believed in a physical resurrection. So when the early church is preaching Jesus rose from the dead as Jews, it's in that context. They believed it was a physical resurrection. Okay? And it's because of that historical material, and because of people like Dr. Peter Williams and others who've done archaeological research and seen that the names of the gospel writers, that are the gospel characters that are mentioned in the gospel resurrection narratives, are exactly mirrored in first century Judaism population size and growth. In other words, it gives you that historical gravitas that these are characters in a real historical situation. Now, that doesn't prove that Jesus rose physically from the dead itself, but what it does show is, if you're going to look at the historical context, you have to acknowledge that the early church preached that Jesus rose from the dead physically. And we'll get on to why that's important in a minute.